The man sitting on the throne had been dead for months. His skin was decaying. His eyes could no longer see the judges standing before him. His mouth could not answer the accusations being shouted across the hall. But that did not stop the trial. In the year 897, the body of a dead pope was pulled from its grave, dressed in sacred robes, placed on a throne, and ordered to defend itself. This was not a legend. This was the Cadaver Synod. Rome, traditionally dated to January of the year 897. Inside the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the most important church in the city, bishops and priests had gathered for an extraordinary council. But this was not an ordinary religious meeting. At the center of the hall sat the accused, Pope Formosus. He wore the sacred robes of the papacy. He sat upon a throne, and he had been dead for roughly 9 months. His body had been removed from its tomb in St. Peter's Basilica. It had been dressed again in papal garments. Attendants had positioned the corpse so that it appeared to face the court. A frightened deacon stood beside it. His impossible task was to speak on behalf of a man who could no longer speak for himself. Presiding over the trial was the living pope, Stephen VI. Stephen did not simply want Formosus condemned. He wanted his entire papacy erased. Every decision, every appointment, every priest he had ordained, every bishop he had elevated. Stephen wanted history to declare that Formosus had never truly been pope at all. But why would anyone go to such lengths against a man who was already dead? The answer begins long before the corpse entered the courtroom. It begins in an age when the papal throne was not only a religious office. It was one of the most dangerous seats of power in Europe. 9th century Rome was nothing like the peaceful image many people imagine today. The Western Roman Empire had disappeared centuries earlier. Powerful families fought over the ruins it had left behind. Kings claimed the right to rule Italy. Dukes marched armies toward Rome. Noble families influenced papal elections. Priests, bishops, soldiers, and assassins moved through the same political world. A pope could bless an emperor one day and be imprisoned by that emperor's enemies the next. The pope held something every ambitious ruler desired: legitimacy. A crown placed by the pope did more than decorate a king's head. It suggested that heaven itself accepted his rule. That made the papacy powerful. It also made every papal election a battle. Formosus entered this world as a talented church diplomat. Born around the early 9th century, he rose through the church and became Bishop of Porto, a town near the mouth of the Tiber River. He was intelligent, experienced, and apparently persuasive. In 866, he was sent as a papal representative to Bulgaria. The Bulgarian ruler Boris had recently accepted Christianity and was deciding whether his growing church would look toward Rome or Constantinople. Formosus impressed the Bulgarian court so deeply that Boris reportedly asked for him to become Archbishop of Bulgaria. It was an extraordinary sign of trust, but it also created a problem. Church law generally opposed bishops abandoning one diocese to take control of another. Formosus was already Bishop of Porto. He could not simply exchange his position for a more powerful one. The request was denied. Formosus returned to Rome, but his reputation had grown. So had the suspicion surrounding him. In the decades that followed, Formosus traveled across Europe as a papal diplomat. He dealt with kings. He carried messages between courts. He became involved in questions of royal succession and imperial power. And in Rome, success could be more dangerous than failure. Pope John VIII began to see Formosus as a possible rival. In 876, Formosus was accused of abandoning his diocese, conspiring against the pope, and seeking greater power for himself. He was excommunicated. He lost his office, and he was forced into exile. For many men, that would have been the end. For Formosus, it was only the beginning. Popes did not always rule for long. Alliances changed. Enemies died. New factions entered Rome. In 883, under Pope Marinus I, the judgment against Formosus was reversed. He was restored as Bishop of Porto. The man who had been expelled from the church had returned to its highest circles. Then, in 891, Formosus was elected pope. His enemies had feared that he wanted the papal throne. Now he had it. But the crown on his head did not make him safe. It placed him at the center of a struggle that was tearing Italy apart. On one side stood the powerful house of Spoleto. Its ruler, Guy III, had been crowned emperor. Guy's son, Lambert, was also crowned as his successor. Together, they hoped to establish a dynasty controlling Italy and the imperial title. Formosus officially recognized them. He even crowned the young Lambert. But it appears that the Pope did not trust Spoleto's growing power. The dukes were close to Rome. Their soldiers could surround the city. Their influence threatened to turn the papacy into a tool of one Italian family. Formosus looked beyond the Alps for protection. He turned to Arnulf of Carinthia. Arnulf was a powerful Frankish king from the Carolingian world. He had armies. He had royal blood. And he had his own claim to Italy's imperial crown. Formosus invited Arnulf to march south. It was a desperate decision. The Pope had already crowned Lambert. Now he was calling Lambert's rival into Italy. This was more than diplomacy. It was a betrayal in the eyes of the Spoleto faction. Arnulf crossed into Italy. His army moved toward Rome. The city became divided between those loyal to Spoleto and those hoping Arnulf would break its power. Formosus was reportedly imprisoned by Lambert's supporters. But Arnulf's forces entered Rome and freed him. In February 896, inside St. Peter's Basilica, Formosus placed the imperial crown upon Arnulf's head. In that moment, Lambert's claim was challenged by the same pope who had once crowned him. It seemed that Formosus had won, but the victory collapsed almost immediately. Arnulf marched south to destroy the remaining power of Spoleto. Then, during the campaign, he became seriously ill. Some accounts describe a stroke or sudden paralysis. Whatever the exact cause, Arnulf could no longer continue. His army withdrew. The protection Formosus had brought into Italy disappeared. The Spoleto faction survived, and the pope who had betrayed it was suddenly exposed. Formosus died on April 4, 896. He was an old man, possibly close to 80. Some later stories claim that he was poisoned, but the evidence is uncertain. Whatever killed him, his body was buried with the honors of a pope in St. Peter's Basilica. It should have ended there. But Formosus had left behind something more dangerous than a living enemy. He had left behind decisions. Bishops appointed by him still held office. Priests ordained by him still performed sacred ceremonies. Arnulf still possessed an imperial crown given by his hands. And Lambert of Spoleto still had supporters determined to reverse everything Formosus had done. After Formosus came Pope Boniface VI. His reign lasted only about 2 weeks. Then Stephen VI became pope. Stephen had his own complicated connection to Formosus. Formosus had previously made Stephen bishop of Anagni. Now Stephen had moved from that bishopric to become bishop of Rome. This mattered because one of the charges later used against Formosus involved the same kind of transfer. A bishop was not supposed to abandon one episcopal seat for another. Formosus had moved from Porto to Rome. Stephen had moved from Anagni to Rome. By declaring Formosus an illegitimate pope, Stephen may have hoped to claim that his own earlier appointment as Bishop of Anagni had never been valid. That would remove the legal obstacles surrounding Stephen's rise. But personal ambition was only one possible motive. The supporters of Lambert and his mother, Ageltrud, also had every reason to destroy Formosus's legacy. Formosus had brought Arnulf into Italy. He had crowned their enemy. He had nearly ended their dynasty. For centuries, the Cadaver Synod was explained as their revenge. Modern historians have questioned whether Lambert and Ageltrud directly ordered the trial. The surviving evidence does not give us a simple answer. Stephen may have acted for the Spoleto faction. He may have acted for powerful Roman nobles. He may have acted to protect his own position. Or all these motives may have come together. But one fact is certain. Stephen decided that ordinary condemnation was not enough. He ordered Formosus to be removed from his grave. Imagine the message this sent across Rome. Death itself would not protect the enemies of the new regime. The papal tomb was opened. Formosus's body was taken from St. Peter's. The corpse was dressed in the robes of a pope. It was carried into the Lateran Basilica, and the trial began. Stephen sat as judge. The assembled clergy watched. Many may have understood that the verdict had already been decided. The dead pope was accused of violating church law by leaving the bishopric of Porto and taking the papal seat in Rome. He was accused of exercising authority after having once been deposed. He was accused of perjury, and he was accused of pursuing the papacy through unlawful ambition. Stephen turned toward the corpse. According to later accounts, he demanded to know why Formosus had seized the Roman papacy while he was still bishop of Porto. The corpse remained silent. It could do nothing else. A deacon assigned to defend Formosus was expected to answer. But what defense could he offer? The man beside him was dead. The living pope controlled the court. Powerful factions surrounded the proceedings. This was not a trial designed to discover the truth. It was a performance designed to produce a verdict. Formosus was found guilty. Stephen declared his election invalid. His papal acts were annulled. The ordinations he had performed were declared worthless. The sacred robes were stripped from his body. The corpse was dressed in the clothing of an ordinary layman. Then came the final humiliation. The fingers of Formosus's right hand that had been used to give blessings were cut away. Medieval sources disagree over whether 2 or 3 fingers were removed. But the symbolism was clear. The hand that had blessed emperors, the hand that had ordained priests, the hand that had crowned Arnulf, would bless no one again. Formosus was first placed in a common or foreigner's grave. Soon afterward, accounts report that his body was removed once more and thrown into the Tiber River. In ancient Rome, the Tiber had often served as the final destination for criminals and disgraced enemies. To deny someone an honorable burial was to attack not only the body, but the memory attached to it. Stephen had achieved his verdict. Formosus was condemned. His papacy had been declared invalid. His body had been mutilated and discarded. But Stephen had made one catastrophic mistake. He believed Rome would accept it. Even in a city accustomed to political violence, the trial horrified many people. This was not simply an attack on one dead man. It threatened the stability of the entire church. If Formosus had never been a legitimate pope, what happened to every priest he had ordained? What happened to every bishop those priests later appointed? Were the ceremonies they performed invalid? Were marriages, baptisms, blessings, and other sacred acts now in doubt? Stephen's attempt to erase one enemy created uncertainty that could spread through generations of clergy. The past could not be destroyed without damaging the present. Stories began to circulate about the body of Formosus. Later chroniclers claimed that fishermen recovered it from the Tiber. Some even wrote that sacred images bowed as the body was returned. These miraculous details cannot be proven, but their message reveals how the story had changed. Formosus was no longer merely the condemned enemy of Stephen. In the minds of many Romans, he had become the victim of an outrage. Stephen's enemies moved against him. Only months after the trial, the living judge suffered a fate almost as grim as that of the dead defendant. Stephen was removed from power. He was arrested. He was thrown into prison. And in the summer of 897, he was strangled. The pope who had judged a corpse was now dead himself. But the struggle over Formosus was not over. Rome entered another rapid succession of popes. Stephen was followed by Romanus, whose reign lasted only a few months. Then came Theodore II. Theodore was pope for roughly 20 days. Yet during that brief reign, he began reversing the Cadaver Synod. Formosus's ordinations were restored. His body was recovered, and the dead pope was returned to St. Peter's Basilica for an honorable burial. The corpse that had been dragged from its grave as a criminal was placed back among the popes. In 898, Pope John IX continued the rehabilitation. A council at Ravenna overturned the Cadaver Synod. The trial was condemned. The clergy who claimed they had been forced to participate were treated with mercy, and future trials of dead people were prohibited. The church was attempting to close the wound. But history rarely closes so easily. The argument over Formosus continued for years. In 904, Sergius III became pope and revived opposition to Formosus. He again challenged the validity of Formosus's ordinations. Writers responded by defending the dead pope and attacking those who had condemned him. The body had been returned to its tomb, but the political battle surrounding it remained alive. That is what makes the Cadaver Synod more than a bizarre medieval story. It was not simply the moment when frightened priests placed a corpse on a throne. It was a struggle over whether power could rewrite reality. Stephen could not change the fact that Formosus had ruled as pope. He could not change the fact that Formosus had crowned Arnulf. He could not reverse years of appointments, alliances, and sacred acts. But he believed that a public spectacle could force the world to accept a new version of the past. So he attacked the symbols. The robes were removed. The blessing fingers were cut away. The body was thrown into the river. The official record was rewritten. Yet the attempt to erase Formosus made him unforgettable. Without the trial, Pope Formosus might have become another distant name in a long list of medieval popes. Because of the trial, His story survived for more than 1,000 years. Stephen wanted to destroy his enemy's memory. Instead, he preserved it forever. History remembers the corpse sitting on the throne. But the true horror was not that a dead man was placed on trial. It was that the living men in the room were willing to pretend the trial was justice. The Cadaver Synod shows what can happen when institutions become weapons, when sacred authority becomes political theater, and when powerful men become so desperate to control the future that they attempt to put the past itself on trial. Formosus entered the courtroom as a corpse. Stephen entered it as the most powerful religious leader in Western Europe. Months later, Formosus was honored again. Stephen was lying dead inside a prison. The judge had lost. The silent defendant had won. But now the final judgment belongs to you. Was Stephen driven by personal revenge? Was the trial part of a larger political conspiracy? Or was it the desperate act of a pope terrified of losing his own power? Tell me which explanation you believe and why in the comments. And if you want to discover more forgotten moments when ambition, betrayal, and power pushed history beyond belief, subscribe to the channel. Because the next story history tried to bury may be even darker than this one.